The straight razor hovered just above the skin of the throat, suspended in the thick, humid air of the barber shop on 125th Street. It was a Saturday afternoon, usually a time of noise, of shouting matches about boxing scores and the clatter of dominoes. But right now, the only sound in the room was the hum of the ceiling fan cutting through the smoke. No one moved. The barber, a man who had held a blade steady through riots and raids, felt his hand tremble. He didn't pull the razor away, but he didn't finish the stroke. He just waited. In the mirror, the reflection of the door opening was the only thing that mattered. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson stepped inside. He didn't slam the door, he didn't have a retinue of bodyguards shoving people aside. He walked in alone, wearing a camel hair coat that cost more than the barber would make in 3 years, and a fedora tilted at an angle that suggested he heard things others missed. He didn't speak, he simply walked to the empty chair at the end of the row, the one that was always empty, even when the shop was full. He took off his coat, folded it meticulously, and sat down. The silence stretched. It was a physical weight pressing down on the chest of every man in the room. This wasn't fear of violence, not exactly. It was something heavier. It was the fear of judgment. Because everyone in that room knew that earlier that morning, a collection envelope had gone missing from a tenement on 118th Street. It was a small amount, $50, meant for a widow whose husband had died on the docks. But the amount didn't matter. The violation mattered. Bumpy looked into the mirror, his eyes scanning the reflection of the men behind him. He didn't ask who took it. He didn't make a threat. He just looked. And in that gaze, you could see the entire machinery of Harlem turning. He was calculating the debt. He was weighing the cost of order against the cost of blood. The barber finally exhaled, the sound loud as a gunshot, and the razor moved again. The world restarted, but the temperature had dropped 10 degrees. Bumpy closed his eyes, and the room understood. Before the shave was finished, the money would be returned, or someone would cease to exist. If you're drawn to the untold power stories of Harlem and the men who ruled without noise, you're already in the right place. This is Bumpy Johnson Files. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. The history books, the ones written by sociologists and crime reporters who never stepped foot north of Central Park, will tell you that Bumpy Johnson ruled Harlem with a gun. They will list the bodies. They will talk about the shotguns and the switchblades and the wars with the Italians. And they are not wrong. The violence was real. But they are missing the engine that made the machine run. They are looking at the lightning and missing the gravity. The files. The notes scrawled by detectives who spent 20 years trying to pin a charge on him, the whispers passed down from grandmothers to grandsons, reveal a much more complex, much more terrifying truth. Bumpy Johnson didn't just run a criminal enterprise, he ran a government. He understood something that the politicians downtown and the mob bosses in Brooklyn never quite grasped. He understood that violence is expensive. Violence brings heat. Violence disrupts business. True power, the kind that lasts for decades, the kind that makes a community protect a gangster from the police, isn't built on fear. It is built on debt. It is built on a complex, invisible economy of favors, protection, and provision. Bumpy Johnson created a system where he was the bank, the judge, and the welfare state. He realized that if you feed a man when he is hungry, he will die for you when you are full. This is the story of the respect economy and how one man monetized loyalty until it was worth more than gold. But to understand the system, you have to understand the architect, and you have to understand the cost of building it. Imagine the isolation. Imagine waking up every morning knowing that every handshake, every smile, every request for help is a transaction. Bumpy couldn't have friends, he couldn't have peers, he could only have dependents and liabilities. There is a specific kind of loneliness that comes with being the Godfather. It is the loneliness of the apex predator who must always appear invincible. He would walk the streets of Harlem, and people would part like the Red Sea. They would tip their hats, they would call out, "Good morning, Mr. Johnson," and he would nod, calm, benevolent. But underneath that cashmere coat, the tension was a wire pulled tight enough to snap bone. He knew that the moment he couldn't solve a problem, the moment he couldn't pay a widow's rent, or get a kid out of jail, or settle a dispute between rivals, the illusion would shatter. He wasn't just protecting his territory from the Italians, he was protecting his people from the chaos of poverty. And the burden of that protection was crushing. Silk hit a dry cleaner on 132nd Street. He pistol-whipped the owner, an old man who had known Bumpy since they were boys. Silk took the cash register, and worse, he laughed about it. He told the old man, "The old ways are over. Bumpy is a museum piece." The word hit the street before the blood on the floor was dry. Harlem held its breath. This was the moment. If Bumpy retaliated with massive violence, he proved he was just a thug. If he did nothing, he proved he was weak. The economy was teetering. Bumpy didn't send a hit squad. He didn't send a message wrapped in a brick. He sent an invitation. He invited Silk to a dinner, a private room at a club on 125th Street, the highest honor. Silk thought he had won. He thought Bumpy was suing for peace, that the old king was ready to share the throne. Silk put on his best suit. He slicked back his hair. He walked into that club like he owned it. Bumpy was sitting at a table set for two, a white tablecloth, crystal glasses, a bottle of expensive wine breathing on the table. But there was no food. Silk sat down, grinning. "I knew you'd come around, old man. It's a young man's game now." Bumpy poured the wine. His hand was steady. He looked at Silk with a gaze that was almost pitying. "You think power is taking things," Bumpy said softly. His voice was a low rumble, like a subway train passing underground. "You think because you have a gun, you have respect, but a gun only buys you fear, and fear has a shelf life." "I got the money," Silk sneered. "I got the street scared." "You have the money," Bumpy agreed, "but you can't spend it." Silk frowned. "What?" "The respect economy," Bumpy said, taking a sip of wine. "I just closed your account." Bumpy stood up. He didn't touch Silk. He didn't raise his voice. He just walked out of the room. Silk sat there confused. He waited for the ambush. He waited for the gunman to burst in. But nothing happened. He poured himself a drink, laughed nervously, and eventually left the club. He walked to his car. It was gone. Not stolen, towed. The tow truck driver, a man Bumpy had helped 5 years ago, had simply moved it. Silk tried to hail a cab. The driver looked at him, saw who he was, and drove past. The driver's sister had her tuition paid by Bumpy. Silk walked to a bar to get a drink. The bartender, whose gambling debts Bumpy had forgiven, put a glass of water on the bar and turned his back. "We don't serve you here." "I got cash," Silk screamed, slamming a wad of bills on the counter. "Your money is no good," the bartender said without turning around. It took 3 days, 3 days of absolute, suffocating silence. Silk couldn't buy food in Harlem. He couldn't get a haircut. He couldn't find a bed to sleep in. His own girlfriend locked the door on him because her father worked for a building superintendent who answered to Bumpy. Silk was a ghost. He was walking through a city that had collectively decided he did not exist. The psychological pressure was worse than any beating. He was rich with stolen money, but he was starving. He was armed, but he was defenseless against a city that refused to acknowledge him. This was the dominance of the respect economy. Bumpy had weaponized the community. He had turned the very people Silk terrorized into the walls of his prison. On the 4th day, Silk was found sitting on the steps of the police precinct. He was weeping. He was begging the police to arrest him. He wanted a cell. He wanted a cage. Because in a cage, he existed. In Bumpy's Harlem, he had been erased. Bumpy never bragged about it. He never mentioned Silk's name again. But the message was burned into the psyche of every aspiring gangster in New York. You don't steal from Bumpy Johnson, and you don't steal from his people. Not because he will kill you, that would be a mercy, but because he will turn the world off. The lesson was clear. Order is expensive, but chaos is unaffordable. As the years went on, the world changed. Heroin flooded the streets, bringing a new kind of madness that no amount of respect could fully control. The civil rights movement began to shift the tectonic plates of power. The Italians got squeezed by the feds, but Bumpy remained. He adapted. He evolved. He sat on the chessboard, moving pieces, always 3 moves ahead. He knew that the ultimate goal of the game wasn't to take the other player's king. It was to make sure the board couldn't be played without you. He became a legend not because of how many men he killed, but because of how he made people feel. He made them feel protected. He made them feel seen. He gave Harlem a sense of sovereignty. In a world that told black men they were powerless, Bumpy Johnson was a king. And even in his final days, when his heart was failing and the era of the gentleman gangster was fading into history, the economy held. When he died, it wasn't a funeral, it was a state procession. Thousands lined the streets. They didn't come to see a criminal, they came to pay their debts. They stood in the rain, silent, respectful. The ultimate return on his investment. A man who has no one to answer to is a dangerous man. But a man who answers to everyone, that is a leader. He built a prison of obligation and called it a kingdom. He ruled not by the sword, but by the ledger. And in the end, he proved that the strongest chains are not made of iron, but of gratitude. This is Bumpy Johnson Files. Subscribe for the stories history tried to bury.